When it comes to ensuring your company has top-notch security practices, things can get complicated and time-consuming fast. Now you can assess risk, secure the trust of your customers, and automate compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, HIPAA, and more with a single platform, Vanta. Vanta's leading trust management platform helps you automate evidence collection, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews. Save hours of work by completing security questionnaires with Vanta AI. Go to securityweekly.com/Vanta to watch their on-demand demo. That's securityweekly.com/VANTA.
On the Security Weekly News, I try to scan and produce a quick look at some of the major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Aaron Layla, and Josh Marpet, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you'll look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Security Weekly listeners can save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 full conference pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through the 9th in San Francisco and on demand. You can register using the discount code by visiting securityweekly.com/RSAC24. Use the code 54USSEC Weekly. Hope to see you there. And I think Lee Neely has joined us. Lee, welcome.
Hey, it's good to be here. It's Wednesday. Do you know who's taking your valuables?
It is Wednesday. And I don't know who's taking my valuables.
Uh-oh.
Maybe they're trying to steal my car with a Flipper Zero, though.
Hey, they can borrow mine. Maybe it'll work.
I thought this article was great. It was the Flipper Zero's response to the Canadian government. And now when I started reading this article, I was like, well, they're just going to tear them to shreds, which they did, but in a way that I didn't expect. I thought it to be more about policy, to your points, Josh, right? But they went into like the technical details on how and people steal cars and do so with especially keyless entry systems in a way, because I think many of us kind of had knowledge in some capacity as to how this is done, but the article does this in such a way that makes it so crystal clear for even the non-technical person. I mean, there's plenty of visual aids. There's videos of car thieves holding the big strands of wire close to the home to receive the signal from the key fob to then relay that to the person near the car. And they show it transpiring on video, diagrams. It's amazing. Amazing. And then they show like, well, how would you do that with a Flipper Zero? They're like, well, you really don't. I mean, unless your car is 20 years old or more, you made it possible, which we've said on the show. I don't think we need to necessarily rehash the technical details. Although, Bill, I feel like you've got a lot of knowledge in this area, being a former car thief. No, I don't know why I feel like you have knowledge in this area. I feel like you have more knowledge in this area for some reason.
Well, yeah. So I think we probably all understood what Flipper's point is, but Paul, I got to tell you, man, I love this article, right? Or this response. That I liked that they kept it light with the graphics, so they were friendly, fun graphics, and then they also they really hit the mark on here's enough technical detail on why this shouldn't matter, and then I don't know if you saw down the bottom. They actually have a petition to not ban the Flipper. I just really enjoyed that. But I got to tell you, before I cut back to you, the thing that I loved the most was you cannot steal a car with a Flipper. You use this, and then they show it, right?
Yeah, they show it.
Yeah.
Side by side. They're like, here's a Flipper, and here's this pile of gear, right? Because you need multiple transceivers, receivers, transmitters to accomplish the attack the way they displayed I thought the camera footage of thieves stealing the cars was the real eye-opening.
I was looking at the illustration and then I scrolled down and saw the video. I'm like, wow,
it's real. It can make people understand it. if they take the time to read the article, and it's not overly technical.
So
Well, I think one thing that really stuck out for me, and that needs to be said more often is the bidirectional nature of the key fobs on modern vehicles, right? So, so I think that the reason Flipper got all mixed up in this is exactly like. So I don't remember which week it was. Maybe it had been last week when Mandy was talking about Dork Phoenix was able to use a flipper to unlock and start her car. Is they're capturing a single code, right? And so flippers can do that, but in order to actually perform an attack, there is a bidirectional communication around the rolling code, and I think that the Flipper article here really did a good job at highlighting that fact.
It needed to be said.
Yeah.
I'm gonna read this. It sounds awesome. I would say all that policy conversation we had, the way that any of us got effective was the power of story and making it accessible to decision makers. We can't just be technically right, which is the best kind of right.
Right.
You have to be heard.
And I think up until this article was published, Josh, many of us were like we're all just kind of like, like that's not how it works. Like here's how it works, and here's the frequencies, and here's all the gear you could use for it. Largely, that's ineffective. If you were to take the elements in this article, present it to the lawmakers in the manner that is presented here, they too would have that aha moment. It wouldn't be technical. It wouldn't go over their heads. They'd be like, oh, that's what it looks like when someone steals a car. Like they're not using a Flipper Zero to do that.
Not yet.
Not yet. So yeah, I think it's silly legislation. I hope it hasn't passed in Canada, right? It's still a proposed ban.
If it did pass, it'd be the fastest thing ever passed.
Yeah.
So I don't think
agree.
so.
And like the other thing too is like they even if you were to use a flipper to do something to a vehicle to help you steal it, let's say the chip in the Flipper Zero is not. That's CC 1101 is. They talked about the history. What was it, 2007? And there's like millions of them that have been produced since then. Like it's a very low cost chip.
Yeah, the first time I heard about this was, do you guys remember the IM.me pager? Like, remember back, like, gosh, I don't even know, that was early 2000s or something. It was a toy marketed to children for bidirectional texting. It looked like a big pager.
Was that Atlas that did that initial research? Did he do the initial stuff? I want to say he did.
I don't recall who was. I mean, at the time I did, but it was
been a while.
Mm-hmm.
We've killed a lot of brain cells since then.
That's true.
Yeah. So, that was awesome stuff.
And
I love the end of the article where they have the sign the petition to
here's how
save
to
the Flipper
protect
Zero.
stuff the right way, and they talk about websites now being encrypted, and then they even talk about improvements in credit cards, even though they're going away.
Yeah, they talk about
migrating
the
from a mag
stripe,
stripe
to
to
the
the chip in near field.
Right. All good examples.
And they get it wrong, but that's not the point.
It's a highlight. It's easy to call things wrong when they bring it up to a higher level, right? It leaves a lot of room for interpretation.
Yep.
What else you guys want to talk about? That was the one I was excited about. You want to stick with cars? Let's stick with cars
actually,
and talk about dash cams and how they're horribly vulnerable. I didn't know this Blackview dash cam apparently for years has been vulnerable to just telling everyone where your location is. Is that essentially the vulnerability here? Is it tells everyone the location of your dash cam, and it's like public, right?
Well, so you have to opt in, right? So, and just for the record, I would say that they are probably. I mean, I don't know if they are the leader in dash cams, but they're known as some of the more higher end dash cams. If you're going to make a suggestion of one, that they're usually on the list. And so, but going through that article, what I saw in that, Paul, was that when you download the app and connect to their cloud, it is denied by default, but you can enable that public viewing of your camera is what I saw. And so what a researcher did is he essentially bought one of these cameras, and then joined using an account that wasn't even, wasn't attached to any kind of camera to his car or anything like that. And he was able to, essentially what he said was, just eavesdrop on people. He said that he heard, private conversations in cars. Basically you could track where people live. I mean, imagine, where your car goes. Also, just all of those kind of things. But their response, I think that the company's response was really the big part of this article, right?
What response?
Well, right. So
Yeah.
their response was, that this is a feature, not a bug, right? It's off by default. Users have the choice to turn it on. And apparently, I don't have the article in front of me, but after reading it, apparently this has been a problem for a long time. The author of that article that you have listed said that he, kind of slept on even publishing it for a year, but even at that, he had seen that other people had brought it up via social media, and he published back what Blackview said, and basically they said, hey, somebody made the choice to make this data public.
That's crazy.
I have a car one for you if you didn't cover it last week.
Yeah.
Did you see the New York Times front page with Cashmere Hill that the
No.
car companies were giving your driving telemetry behavior to
To
insurers?
insurance companies. Now, it's interesting. We always theorized that this would be the case.
And
When we started talking about hacking cars, interfacing with OBD2 ports, and devices started coming on the market that you could plug into the OBD2 port that had, I think, a 3G, at the time, 3G cellular modem that transmitted the telemetry back, and you'd get a break on your insurance. So you could opt into this.
Yes.
And we cautioned people at that time and said, this may not be always an opt-in. This could be something that is just going to happen.
So I mentioned in the first block the 5-star automotive cyber safety framework we did on our first birthday, so over 9 years ago. Star number 3 was tamper evident forensically sound evidence capture. We said you can't decree that there's no evidence of hacking if you have no evidence capture to prove otherwise.
Right.
And the privacy lawyers at all the car companies lost their minds and said, we will never do this. The privacy of our drivers is of the utmost importance. And I love to see that
Went out the window.
the very companies that wouldn't put a safety logging in to see if you were doing the Chris and Charlie hack, for example, we're just giving this stuff away.
That's interesting. It's a creepy thing. We need legislation to kill this. We need to say you can't collect data without our knowledge and have it
add
affect
it to
our
the list,
insurance.
Josh.
You can always buy a dumb car, I guess, if there's still any out there.
Good luck with that. I don't think. Can you buy it? I think it's like a monitor or a TV rather. Right? You can't buy a TV.
You need to get the dumb car that still has the wooden tires.
Well, you pay more for
gold.
it. That's the problem. Is you pay more for it. You pay more for privacy.
You need 2 cars, right? One that you drive, and then one that you drive slow and real safe, that way.
It is like 15 miles a day. You take that car, you drive it down to Dunkin' Donuts at like 12 miles an hour, and you drive it back, and then you go jump in the 1968 Camaro that's got no telemetry in it at all.
But the part that caught me was it wasn't even that the driver was bad. They were using driver assist features. So it was the self-driving that was bad.
Oh,
and then your insurance went up. So the car's built-in performance was causing you a higher.
I can see that.
Lawsuit, may not be a millionaire.
I did that. I did the self-driving thing or the assisted driving in my Tesla, and I hit a construction zone. Like literally the first time I turned it on, we're on the highway, and I'm like, because I got to see how this works. Right, it's the first couple of weeks of my Tesla. I'm like, we got to see how this works. And of course, I wait till my car is full of like family and friends and stuff, right? I'm like, we're gonna all test this together, right? You're all enjoying the Tesla. We're gonna test it out together. And so you still, in the mode that I have, you still have to keep your hands on the wheel. You don't have to do anything at the wheel, but you have to hold it enough so that it senses that you're holding it, which was super, super annoying. by the way. And so I'm doing that. And then we hit a construction area and like it starts going into the Jersey barrier. I'm like, well, turning that off. All set with that. Tested it. Yep. Not for me.
It's proof you're a bad driver, though.
It would be, in this case, it would be proof that I'm a bad driver.
Mine, you only have to put one finger on the steering wheel. So you just have to have just enough pressure. And of course, there's easy ways to rig that. My Volvo actually drove all the way from Boston to north of Providence. Perfect.
With one finger on the wheel?
Yep. And it was
or
just,
maybe a beanbag or something.
well, I'm saying you could easily come up with all kinds of mechanisms like a rubber band wrapped around your ankle or something and just move your foot every now and then and it's fine. But it actually did a perfect job until it got
to the...
Did your
finger get tired? Or did you switch fingers?
You know, I mean,
you had the rubber band?
Yeah. It's like put my face on the wheel for a while, that kind of stuff. Set my drink on the wheel.
I set my scotch on the wheel.
Yeah.
It was fine.
But it did a great job until it got where the road was kind of crazy.
Yes.
And the lines weren't painted right. And it started getting really scary trying to maintain speed through these curves and traffic. But it actually did a pretty good job.
Was that an Animal House? Was it an Animal House? They painted the line so that the parade went a different route or something.
No, he
like
just
that.
No, he redirected.
He just walked out and led the band into the alleyway.
Yeah, that's what I feel like it is. You just got to lead the band.
That's what
right
that
into the alleyway.
The
baton, the drum major. He just
yeah.
shoved the actual drum major out of the way, and then for some reason the people in the band didn't notice.
And
that now there was like a middle-aged man leading them.
That's like a
who was supposed to be a college student. But
craziness. Craziness.
You want to talk about
it was
Undersea cables
Stork
being
actually.
cut?
It was Stork.
They're all colleges.
Who was one of the original writers for National Lampoon and all that.
Oh, one of my favorite topics to talk about is who created Bitcoin. Because I find it fascinating. I mean, I guess not fascinating enough where I want to spend time as like a pseudo investigative journalist, but it's one of those life's mysteries, especially if you work in technology, that like it really irks me because I just want to know. I think as hackers
I think Amelia Earhart wrote Bitcoin originally.
Yeah, that's
the proof of
another one.
concept.
Who's the guy that jumped out of the plane?
DB Cooper.
DB Cooper.
I was just going to say
Yeah.
DB Cooper.
This is like the DB Cooper of our generation.
Isn't that Loki?
Yeah. Mystery solved. Maybe Loki also created Bitcoin. You know, that could be that's a wonderful
caused
thing.
a great deal of mischief.
That's right. It
wasn't Craig Wright that we know.
But it wasn't Craig Wright. And I am really disappointed because I know Craig Wright. And if he did create Bitcoin, I could tell people that aren't in our field, especially to impress them, be like, I know the guy that created Bitcoin. Like I had beer.
Well, now you can say, I know the guy that didn't invent
I
Bitcoin.
know the guy that pretended that he created Bitcoin.
He's not right, but wrong.
The funniest part about this story, though, and I got this from another podcast I was listening to called Hacked, because I didn't see. I heard it on the podcast, but they covered the story, but I didn't see it in any of the articles. But apparently, in the court proceedings, Craig's sister testified that as a young child, Craig used to like to dress up as a ninja. Therefore, when she saw Satoshi Nakamoto, she was like, "Oh, well, that must be Craig."
Case closed.
Right?
Who else could it be?
Case closed. I mean, that is clear evidence. I don't understand how they came to the conclusion that Craig didn't create Bitcoin. I don't get it. He dressed up as a ninja.
That's a little more like Newsmax journalism, but yeah.
Right? I mean, we probably dressed up as a ninja at least once. Maybe we created Bitcoin. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe even later tonight.
Right? Maybe yesterday.
I used to dress up as a ninja in college
and
sneak around campus. It was fun.
Well, that's the thing. No one saw you, so no one could testify on your behalf, Jeff.
That's right.
They saw you dressed up as a ninja, so it wouldn't work. Anyway.
So you want to talk about undersea cables?
Yes, let's do it.
So several cut cables took 6 African countries offline. Pretty much it's the only viable way to connect them is with those undersea cables, and they're about 1.86 miles below the surface, so it's not like somebody dropped an anchor on them or got down there. And so I thought that was but one of the more interesting things I found, which is my story number 3, and if you haven't got the show notes, reload. there's a link to the undersea cable map, and it's an incredible amount of cables that are under there. Like 99% of international traffic goes through these cables because the latency with satellite doesn't make it is not a viable alternative, and pulling lines over on land is also a problem. So, like I said, I thought that was really interesting, and I was also thinking, remember when we used to have a T3 line and we could fail back to a T1, and then we tried it and it didn't work anymore? Same idea with satellite. I'm wondering how many people have said, "Oh, we'll fail over to satellite," and actually tried it.
Doesn't work. I'm wondering how did that cable get cut though? Was it just
They think it was a volcano. It was undersea seismic activity or something.
Swamp gas.
Or a kraken.
Sharks, the megalodon.
The
Or a
Chinese.
submarine with a big saw thing on the front,
Right. Well, they did that.
Yeah.
They did that. Malicious Life podcast did an episode on. They talked all about scuba diving, and then they talked about how in one of the world wars there was a teletype cable, and they actually put like basically a sniffer on it. It was a whole. This story reminded me of that, Lee.
Yeah.
I have to go dig it up in the archives because it was. I'd actually go back and re-listen to it because there was a lot of details in it. It was really cool.
Are you going to dig it up or do a deep dive?
Gotta do a deep dive. I want to do a deep
I wonder
dive.
do you know what protocol those
I'm
cables?
not holding my breath here, guys.
I mean, could you tap that if you went down there like in a submersible?
Paul would tap that.
Oh, of course, in a crotchless ninja costume. But
I have one.
yeah,
I'll bring it next. I'll bring it next time.
I know you have one. There was that unfortunate event when I came by to bring you that casserole that time. But yeah,
Doug's always bringing me casserole.
I do that. Because I know he's in there smoking his meat.
The whole tapping issue is an interesting thing. And if you haven't seen a cross section of the undersea cables, you should probably Google that. There are very, very thick cables, and depending on the cable, and I don't have it in front of me, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of pairs of wires that are going in there. And so tapping it has been both a nation state activity that has occurred. And just when you see a cross section of that, and a lot of them are fiber, right? So just seeing how somebody would do that is very, very difficult. And if you haven't, I nerd out about on this stuff, right? So, but you should also go look at like the landing stations, and I'm sure Jeff probably has some intel on that, but that we, as somebody who has had to secure landing stations, so that is when the wire comes out of the ocean, right, and then it's got to go in on the beach somewhere. How do you secure those buildings appropriately? Because now it truly is something that you could get in and tap and have some influence there, and those are very interesting spots on many beaches. I guess would be the best way to say that. So.
I think all you have to do to protect it is apply PCI. And,
that's it.
And say zero trust 3 times.
Yeah, that's much more of a zero trust issue.
Yeah.
Because PCI,
I believe that
after
is,
all, doesn't care if you
and-
complete the transaction. Just don't lose the data.
Well, what's interesting about the landing stations is which government owns it is a very gray area. Yeah.
And who already has it tapped because they own it, and
and do the ISPs think they own it?
Of course they do.
That's right. That's a good question. That is a great question. Moving on, Paul. Choose something else.
So I want to go to one of Sam's stories because I've been thinking a lot about this lately. The NIST NVD has stopped enriching CVEs a month ago.
Yeah, and I see Lee has it too. Lee might be a better person to speak about it because, I mean, what's going on at NIST? Do you have any ideas?
My first thought is it's fallout from all the CVE discussions we've had over the last couple of months with all the issues of CVEs.
Well, there's the yellow warning on the NVD website.
Anyway,
it doesn't quite say that, hey, we've stopped enriching data. just as like,
Yeah.
oh, we're gonna create a committee.
But I guess we should state the problem. I mean, for more than a month, they haven't been putting out enough information about CVEs. So all the vulnerability products that rely on that list are now a month behind, and people are freaking out. And
Everyone relies on that. Well, not most people in organizations rely on that list. Also for regulatory compliance, also
and yet
relies on
and
the
yet
accessibility of that data.
that's the thing. But we don't have a business relationship. We don't have a terms of service. So I guess we were wrong to assume they would always provide that list in an efficient and timely manner. But now it's not clear what people should do.
I don't believe that there's folks sitting at NIST that are enriching it. I heard that it was outsourced, that enrichment, and we so heavily rely on it that it's
So is it
dangerous.
cuts? I mean, is it budget cuts, or are they updating something, or is it experiencing political pressure that somebody doesn't want this to happen? I mean, I wonder if anybody on the inside has leaked out what's going on.
Josh, what's
is
going on?
Josh is so
Josh?
quiet, and he has this look on his face like he knows something, but he can't say, which
So-
I respect, and I don't want you to get in trouble. I want anyone else to
But what
get in
can you
trouble.
tell us?
But what can you tell
What
us?
I can say is NVD was struggling pretty bad in 2017. House Energy and Commerce wrote a nice letter
Mhm.
saying what the hell's going on. There were a few issues that were problematic. One was that at the time they had 60% of the knowledge that OSVDB had as a free volunteer service.
Mhm.
Another problem that Kurt was focused on was we need to federate CNAs. The rate of growth was faster than they were funding. And there wasn't quite a CISA yet, but we still had the US CERT and the DHS participation. So some people blame just NIST. And we fixed a few of the problems, but NIST kind of got off scot-free at that time.
Mhm.
So the federated CNA thing happened. They started publishing more. They started doing CVSS scores faster, but the CVSS quality got crappy. And they don't really do
Wait,
CP.
I have a procedural question. If there's a CNA that's not MITRE, do they provide a CVSS in addition to NVD, or is that up for whatever?
You could have a
case by
whole
case? Anyone,
episode. You could have a whole episode on this,
I
but
know.
here's
You could have a whole talk on it, which is what I'm giving a B-side.
what I'm encouraging right now, because a lot of people are writing an open letter. You can see it being passed around with Kurt and Josh and Dan Lawrence and Chris Hughes and a bunch of other people. And we started some back channel recently. There might be a big fight about this at the first CVE event in Raleigh.
I hear that is the event.
There was going to
we're
be a big
get more
fight.
information.
It turns out it won't be the big fight. It'll be some of the fight. But what people, without admiring the problem, the NVD, so a CNA writes their own CVE and they score themselves. Later, NIST is supposed to add a different score because the people that write it always write a lower score because they don't want to trip a threshold, especially if it's your own software.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like fox guarding the hen house. So they're supposed to update it later. But a large chunk of this is funded by CISA now. And CISA cut some funding. And another chunk is farmed out to MITRE Corporation and CertCC and CMU, SEI. So there's been a little bit of brinksmanship and chicken on budget. It does need more money, but maybe not just more money. Maybe it could innovate and do things better. There are some CNA problems. A lot of people really want CPEs to be published, but what people didn't pay attention to is NIST leadership very vocally, very often since the SBOM stuff started, made it really clear they've kind of abandoned CPE. So while they have been adding CPEs and people want them to, they've kind of abandoned and given up on it.
Yeah, but CPE coverage was never great.
It was never great, but the loudest people right now
just
are
for
begging
giggles,
for CPEs.
CPE is
Common platform enumeration. It's supposed to be
It identifies a final
platform.
good assembler type thing.
Josh said it better than I was going to
So
say.
there's a lot of pieces to this, and if we want to learn from the past, we fixed some of the problems last time with congressional oversight, but we did not fix all of them. And I hope this time we measure twice, cut once.
Yeah.
We actually say, what are all the things we need, which are likely to be funded, which are dying or dead, and we get this thing funded, because what everyone agrees on is things like CVE, KEV, NVD are cyber critical infrastructure. They enable other cyber stuff to happen. So this is too important to fail, and it's pretty outrageous. So whether this was like someone wasn't paying attention at the budget meeting, there's a little bit of interagency spat between NIST and CISA, whether it's the fact that we're in a continuing resolution right now, so they don't get all their money and they might get less of the money they had. I don't want a half measure again. Like, we should find out what we really need to fix and make sure it's properly funded.
Because if we don't, commercial entities are going to come in and try and fix it. And you already see that. And look, I'm not going to knock the commercial entities that are trying to provide a better source of data, right? But my concern with that is there could be bias, right? And there could be longevity issues. What happens when that company gets bought and then the acquirer goes, yeah, you're putting effort into this thing that you're giving away for free. A million different scenarios could happen.
Yeah.
Well, I want to trust the government, but with oversight, I think I have a higher degree of confidence that we could have an accurate system with integrity if it's run within the government, again, with some oversight.
So to get budget and oversight, you need Congress. And one of the big problems here is NIST has oversight from House Energy and Commerce, and CISA has different oversight, right? So they don't even have the same committees. So you can't even solve all the problems.
Oh, God. So now you got committees within other committees that have to agree on committee stuff.
Right. And I'm going to be very careful in my words here. As you increasingly see CVEs and KEVs and things showing up as a regulatory burden, it would be a catastrophic failure to let a private entity take control of this, because they may sit on these, they may delay these, they may defer these. So you don't want regulation to be throttled up and down by private interest. So I really hope the government can put aside their differences, get the real requirements, and fix this. And I hope that whatever letters and advocacy all of us do, make sure that we really, measure twice, cut once on this.
But what I also don't want is a million different ways to measure and track vulnerabilities and severity. And I think that's where we're going now, is we just keep coming up, and now vendors start stepping in and coming up with their own measurements. I don't think it's measure and track.
I think it's scoring, rating.
Scoring, rating, measuring, tracking.
Well, and everyone hates it when I remind them this, but CERT-CC put out an open letter saying CVSS doesn't work for, it's not meant to be a risk score. It's meant to be scores that are observable for the vulnerability. The risk has to come in the context of the use and the consequences.
Right.
And everyone treats it as a risk threshold.
But you can score it on your own and take into account, but I feel like no one does.
You're supposed to.
But you can find the letter. It says, don't fix CVSS, don't augment it, replace it. Now, there have been some debates about what to replace it with, but there's sort of like a half commitment to CPE, a half commitment to SWID, a half commitment to CVSS reform or replace.
SWID?
Oh,
what's
software
SWID?
ID?
Software ID. Thank you. Sorry.
So they wanted to put their eggs in the SWID basket instead of the CPE basket, but now we have two that don't work. So in the open source world, there's Perl. There's a lot of ways to fix this, but there's no single easy fix button. And people are mad, so they're trying to get one or two things passed. I would like us to properly evaluate what we need, because you only get this debate every couple of years, and then it just flares up again.
Right. So, two questions. Well, question and a comment. Question is, why do we care so much about this when only 3% of the CVEs have been exploited?
Well, the database of everything that could be is important and could be used later. But right now,
are you looking for a better?
Yeah, when you're a product owner
ranking?
that's going to carry some sort of regulation or software liability, you should focus on the ones that are being exploited or more likely to be exploited. I always loved EPSS by Michael Reutman. People didn't like it because it was commercial at Kenna or now Cisco, so he gave it to first, but it hasn't really been
Is
maintained.
that where it came from? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, actually, the origin story of this is, I could say, one breath of oxygen. I wrote this thing called H.D. Moore's Law. I said the strength of an unskilled adversary grows at the rate of the Metasploit project. Because when I said that, Ed Bellis was in the audience, and he's like, "Oh my God, my data scientists could prove this." So they looked at, if you were in Metasploit, you were 30 times more likely to be exploited than a 9 out of 10. He then kept just enriching it with correlated information about what's the product, what's the words in the description, and he got a really strong thing. So it went from like Metasploit to, is it in Metasploit and Exploit DB, to what are the keywords, and he got it really well honed for an enterprise.
I'm not going to dispute that
Yeah.
research or that approach,
Yeah.
but as EPSS stands today,
It's not doing what it was doing. Yeah.
because if I spot check it, it's grossly inaccurate.
Yeah. In fact, I always said with Michael, if you had an EPSS per sector, so like manufacturing, medical devices, et cetera, like if the correlated logic was appropriate for fit for purpose for that sector, it would be super valuable. And when it was given to First, which is a great organization, it no longer had the stain of being associated with a single private company, but it hasn't really been fed and maintained the way he was maintaining it.
With AI where it is today,
Oh, I'm sure
we
this
should be able to apply models.
I believe
They can-
EPSS
even if it-
should be resuscitated.
Even if it
Yeah.
gets us 90% accuracy,
Yeah.
let's say that's my threshold for accuracy, it would be invaluable because we as humans can't take into account all of those variables. That's a great job for AI. And so why not? We know what the variables are, and we've continued to get better at knowing what those variables are. And we have historical data that can be used to train models.
The best place I use, so you should always do Kev first, now that Kev exists, but that's after the fact. When I was running a PCERT and we had a coordinating disclosure program, we didn't have a CVE yet in most cases. So the best thing I could do was run it through the EPSS correlation to tell me relatively how serious it could be. And then we'd look at our threat model to see how bad can it be in the application. So for PCERTs, it's awesome, but it has not really been maintained.
So my second comment is you mentioned the need for sort of personal accountability for companies to come up with risk, determine the risk on their own. That's been a requirement in PCI since 2010.
Here we go. It's back to
It's back.
PCI, Josh.
Back to PCI. Everything comes back to PCI.
All roads lead back to PCI.
And nobody's ever done it, but it's been in there. But they've missed it. If there was a way to do it and do it easily and it was published and available and recognized, that would certainly help things.
And just to be nice to Art and their old team, I should also mention SSVC, the CVSS backwards. That's stakeholder specific vulnerability category or something like that. Can't remember the last C, but that is a decision tree. So it doesn't give you a number at the end. It just tells you fix immediately, fix eventually, track, or ignore.
Right.
And you can even have a Kev that triages to ignore, but people have not really. There's been some pockets that have embraced it, but it has not taken off. People want a number.
And I guess, I mean, for a couple years, it's been a few years. It might have been, I think it was before COVID. You know, the buzzword at RSA and Black Hat was prioritization. I mean, that fits here, right? I mean, it's calling it something else, but everybody wants to know, what do we need to fix now versus tomorrow versus we don't really need to worry about it.
But I think a number is not going to get you there.
No, it's got. I like the idea.
It's too complicated. It's a variable among a million variables, because I can say there's a vulnerability on this laptop that all you got to do is send a TCP packet to it with a certain setting and it'll take over the whole laptop. Okay, that's really bad. But if the laptop's not even connected to a network, there's no risk. I mean, it's a very simple example. When you start mixing all this stuff together and you say, we got all these devices and all these things and how many users and who's got access to what, it gets so complicated so fast that it just overwhelms people. And that's why they want a number, because the boss wants somebody to say, prioritize this. What's 1, what's 2, what's 3? And it's not that simple, but that's what everybody wants.
Well, and the lawyers are in the mix now too,
Of
because
course.
now when you have your published secure development lifecycle or your commitments through the sales process, it'll say we will fix CVSS 9 and higher. So people start playing with, is there any way to make it an 8.9?
I live that. Yeah, I live.
Well, I know when we've had the discussion about CVEs and the 3% exploited, we also, and I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was like 70 or 80% of the vulnerabilities landed at like 7.3 or 8.3 or something like that. There's some predominant number that always showed up.
Well, the one that I always go back to is Billy Rios found 2 medical flaws. One was in a Pyxis, which is basically a vending machine. Like you go and you get supplies out of it. And it scored, because it could leak data, it scored like a 9.3 or something. Whereas he did the bedside infusion pump that caused the recall, where you could empty 3-hour dose in 30 seconds, and it scored a 6.2 because it was really biased towards confidentiality of data. And he's like, this is wrong. And no matter what I do to try to manipulate CVSS, I can't get the appropriate life and death one as high as the vending machine. So that got the attention of quite a few people in cyber physical systems and the DoD and an FDA.
Well, there's a whole nother topic for a segment sometime, is the CIA concept of data security and how the whole world knows C. We do a little bit for I, not so good with the A.
And the A in the hospitals is what's killing people.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also it's only effective if there is a CVE assigned to it. And we all can't sit around this table and remote and go, well, every vulnerability we know about has a CVE.
Well, back to your silent patching story.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's a great segue, actually. JetBrains and Rapid7 went at it. And from what I read, JetBrains basically said, well, we're going to fix it, but we're not going to acknowledge it as a vulnerability. Interesting. My day job at Eclipsium had the same incident happen with Zixil.
Mm-hmm.
I don't agree with the silent patching because, and I've said this for many, many years, because when we looked at wireless routers, this was, and still is today, I believe, rampant, that Linksys, Netgear, D-Link, whatever, go back to 2007, we would go, there's a vulnerability there. Where is it fixed? And every time Larry and I would dig into it, we'd go, well, they fixed that. But we look at the release notes, and either it wasn't there or it was just called out in such a way that you wouldn't really know that it was a security vulnerability. There's no score associated with it. There's no CVE associated with it. It's just like, yeah, everyone should. They run under the assumption that everyone is going to update or upgrade to the latest version of the product. And we all know, we've been in IT for a long time, that is completely not reality. Nobody does that. And they shouldn't do that. I mean, they have to weigh the operational risk and the security risk, but without the knowledge, how are they supposed to do that?
Well, if they fix it in version X and someone has or they fix it in version Y and someone has version X, and they don't know that there's a security difference between X and Y, and
Right.
they don't want to go through the hassle of why would I upgrade from X to Y? There's no reason
Right.
to upgrade from X to Y. So they're going to stay vulnerable and not know they're vulnerable because they silently fixed it. I wonder if the SEC stuff here for the publicly traded companies might weigh in on something like this. Like, what did you know? When did you know it? And did you disclose it to your shareholders and customers?
But the story goes deeper. Hold on. I want to read some
Insert
quotes.
dramatic music here.
We need dramatic music. Where is this story on my list? This is the bane of my existence, trying to figure out which story.
Number 5.
It's number 5 in your list.
Thank you. So there's a quote from JetBrains. They say, at this point, we made a decision not to make a coordinated disclosure with Rapid7, as we strongly believe that publishing all technical details at the same time as releasing a fix allows anyone to immediately exploit the issue before all customers have had a chance to patch their servers.
Why would their customers patch if they don't know it's broken?
Well, maybe JetBrains' point is we're just going to tell you that it's broken and tell you. I don't know if JetBrains said it was a vulnerability or they just said you need to upgrade. I don't know if that came through in this particular article, but
But we talked about this with your Eclipsium issue a month ago or so. If JetBrains is telling their clients you really need to upgrade because it's a security issue without giving the details, is that good enough for them to do it versus it's fed into a scan engine in companies that are only responding to the vulnerabilities that pop?
I guess as a
and
customer,
it comes through a CVE.
like, I can't evaluate the risk without knowing the details. Am I really vulnerable, or does my environment somehow have a compensating control? Do I implement that feature? How much detail you're going to give? Like, the amount of detail you would have to give me as a customer, you would have to. It's the same amount of detail that an attacker needs to develop an exploit, and that's how we end up with.
Maybe there is some security through obscurity.
That's what they're advocating
I'm
for.
kidding.
It's
Yeah.
security through obscurity.
And it's like one of the only first principles we all agree on. But let's steel man their argument and say, okay, this particular one is such a beautiful, unique snowflake that it would hurt people if they got out before it was patched. So why don't they create a CVE shortly thereafter? It doesn't sound like they're going to create a CVE ever.
Correct.
Do you think some of this is the don't feed the lawyer sign? The more detail you provide about what's going on, the more likely it is somebody jumps on that and says,
Could be. That could be a flag. That
I
could be
can
a
just
flag.
see, I can hear corporate legal on my phone right now saying, could you write it in such a way that it doesn't specifically state what went wrong? Because that basically is just boilerplating the lawsuit that's going to be filed against us. Whereas otherwise they'll have to do discovery, try to figure it out, hire a bunch of experts. That makes it really expensive.
Okay, so before the news, I said some people in Europe are going to beat us to software liability. We're still talking about it here. In a software liability world, they have every right to say, we're going to roll the dice. This is our decision. And if we're wrong, you can sue us.
Right.
But right now, they can do this, not give the transparency, not give the information, and still not be sued. So if you want to opt for liability versus transparency, then stand behind the results.
My question to you, Josh, though, is playing devil's advocate somewhat. Is there a way to evaluate risk because of other environmental factors, sensitivity of data, the systems, the location, what they do, independent of understanding the technical details?
There could be, but think about even a medium enterprise. How many product services from different vendors? Do you really want to have your enterprise governance and risk management and vulnerability management dashboards have a special bespoke decision path per vendor? Or do you want to have a common denominator to look at comparative risk?
I'm not even
That's
thinking.
but you're making the argument for we just need a CVSS score, and we patch everything that's 8.0 or greater.
I didn't say the CVSS was the right thing to trigger off of. But if you want to know, are there any known vulnerabilities, or what do I patch today, or what do I patch in my next change management window? You need decision support. So perhaps there's an alternative decision support that's not a number or a CVE, but right now, the thrust of the industry.
But also hold on. But also things change, right? So let's say you're advocating for we should not assign a CVE, we should not recognize it as a vulnerability, and you should just go to the next version. What you lose is that accountability in that tracking of there is a vulnerability in this version of software. It has this moniker, maybe it's a CVE. Put the impact and severity aside. Like we need to be able to track that. Because things change. I may go back a version. I may acquire a company. I need to go evaluate their software. There's a million different reasons why I need to track that particular CVE in that product.
Yeah, and I hate studying individual CVEs. I like to cluster, especially if you have a large portfolio you're responsible for. Look at the CWEs, right? So for all the CVEs, what are the underlying CWEs? Let's bulk up our training on avoiding those.
Right.
That
But
hit us the
also-
worst.
And again,
Also
CWE stands for
Common weakness
weaknesses
enumeration.
enumeration.
So it's a class of mistake that a CVE instantiates.
But also, there could be an exploit for it today, or there could be an exploit for it tomorrow, or it could be 6 months or a year.
And how many times is there recidivism where the fixed bug comes back?
Yes,
Or-
that too.
Or the first fix doesn't really fix it? You need 2 or 3 or 4 fixes?
Mhm.
Let me put to the question to you this way, Josh. The three things that you talked about in the first segment absolutely have to do these things.
The bad practices?
The bad practices. How do you quantify those in terms of a risk ranking that you just drop in and say, this applies? You don't need to understand the technical, but this applies.
So those 3 did not mention vulnerabilities.
Right.
They said
That's my point.
unsupported
They're unrelated,
hard coded passwords,
but related.
single factor authenticated remote access. So yeah, you could,
but they're really bad, but
they're
they
really
don't
bad.
have a CVE or anything associated with it. But we all know that they're really bad. How do you make those the rule of the land, or that category, or that type of thing?
So we definitely did risk management before Steve Christie-Coley and team blessed us with CVE.
Mm-hmm.
It was 10 different names, 20 different names from 20 different vendors for the same exact bug. So we did do it. It wasn't something I'd like to go back to. So the lingua
Wait,
franca.
say that again.
Before CVE,
Yeah,
we would have.
before CVE. So we
We definitely did risk management.
90s,
To your straw man,
Mm-hmm.
you can do risk management without a common unique identifier
Right.
that's tracked and monitored and managed over time. We did it. I just think we did it pretty badly.
Right.
So we could go back to that where there's 20 names from 20 vendors for the same flaw. I'd prefer not to.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is there a way to do that, but do it in a way that's more palatable, that's scalable, that can be accepted by the consumers out there, the companies out there, that's just accepted as, if it's got this caveat, this asterisk, we know it's bad, without getting into the technical details. and it's something that a vendor could drop it in there and say, this is DEFCON 4, DEFCON 5. Trust us.
So you want balkanized, bespoke, divergent schemas per vendor.
I'm asking if that's viable. If that is that, would that be helpful for the class of, again, to the first segment, the hospitals, the organizations out there that are cash poor, they don't have security people, they don't have IT people, but they know they get, and of course it's not them, it's the.
Yeah, I believe at scale that would lead to lots of errors and omissions and harm. I mean, look, Ubiquity, I mentioned earlier, Ubiquity had some flaws. They never assigned CVEs. They put out patches. They were harshly criticized for it. If you heard about it, you could still patch it without a CVE.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people didn't patch it. And they got a false sense of security when they looked at their asset inventory and they saw no CVEs associated. So maybe we're over relying on CVE.
Well, and they're not doing that. They're looking at their scan and not getting
sometimes
findings.
Yeah.
I think that's more the norm for the companies that do the scanning. That's what they're looking
in
for.
hospitals, a lot of the older equipment can't be scanned. So they rely purely on offline associated vulns.
Mm-hmm.
Also, there's product support, which I'm running into exactly with Ubiquity.
Is it Ubiquity again?
Yeah. I have a Gen 1 cloud key, and from what I can tell, I can't upgrade it. Or if I can upgrade it, like the Debian version on it is just so borked right now that if I start treading in those waters, I could drown. And by drowning, I mean my Wi-Fi goes out at my house, and I have 3 kids, and that's a bad day.
I think it was Adrian Sanabria said that he had done this huge Ubiquity mesh for his home, and like they decided they don't want to support that one anymore. And he's like, I just spent all this money and all this time, and they're just dropping support for it.
I think Sam had a comment.
Yeah, is there any motion towards making a CVE for threat groups? Because right now it's exactly the situation you described. There's like 10 different names for the same group from different vendors.
Yeah, I kind of hate that.
It gives the advantage to the attackers in my mind when we do that.
Yeah. I certainly understand your logic. I mean, I think right now there are too many names.
But it's the same thing when companies get acquired and their products get different names, and you don't even know that that's the same product. So how are we going to evaluate the security of a product when it's been acquired, like Avanti, several times over?
Yeah.
And this also comes in. I mean, I talked about a commercial library or commercial software that was included for IPsec VPNs, that the provider of that component had been acquired multiple times.
Yeah.
So how do you trace back all the people that have consumed that component in all of the different forms that component can present itself? I mean, that's somewhat of an edge case, but it gets into, now we're getting into like libxml and other things where now there's multiple CVEs issued from multiple vendors that are calling it, conceivably, to your point, Sam, something different, but it's the same thing, and it needs to be down to the library, and CPE could shine here by saying this is in the library. Maybe it's also in these products, but catalog all of them.
Audie's in the green room. She'd probably remind me which one it was, but I think it was like Ripple 20. They thought it was in particular real-time operating system, but it was actually in an open source library used by 20 different real-time operating systems. So they actually had to put out
TCP/IP stack vulnerabilities. Yeah.
Maybe if I can segue, the solution isn't to focus on the vulnerabilities, but to establish zero trust.
And you're all about zero trust this week.
Well, it's because I have the perfect storm article that NSA published zero trust guidelines, and in their guideline, they largely reference a retailer. They don't say it in the document.
Target.
It was Target. They reference the Target breach and how the Target breach could have been avoided if they had followed the zero trust guidelines that NSA is putting out, which includes, among other things, microsegmentation. So it's an NSA document that talks PCI.
PCI did not invent microsegmentation.
It did not. Neither does it require it.
No.
Which is the mistake that this article makes, because they cite it, and the article mentions, well, they're talking about Target and they're talking about PCI, and they state that PCI requires segmentation, which it doesn't. It's still a recommended action. PCI in its original inception assumed a flat network, do all the security things to your entire enterprise. It's the evolution of people really trying to dodge the security and how to avoid it, and how do we make it so we don't have to do this. They've come up with the concept of a card data environment, which is segmented away from the rest of their environment.
This straw man may be moot
Mm-hmm.
because we have CRA passed into law moving forward later this year, and we have the SEC rulings.
Yeah.
And I believe if more people are doing these shadow silent patching, they may either be on the wrong side of SEC or on the wrong side of CRA.
Yep.
So even if theoretically we could make do without them getting on board, they might be shunned, punished, or financially hurt for trying to make a new patch.
Well,
Well,
and speak to that real quick. Because none of this regulation or policy means anything unless it's got teeth.
Mhm.
So what are the consequences, potential consequences of not following, not abiding by
People can't
the
buy your
acts that are coming?
product.
It depends what the infraction is. And
But
which-
I
what-
like people can't buy your product.
you like that one.
I like that one.
Yeah.
Well, with the FDA, they haven't done this purely for cyber yet. But if you have FDA has a law enforcement side, and you remember the MedSec muddy water predatory stock short on the St. Jude pacemakers, where they revealed some flaws on Bloomberg. FDA had to investigate. They were also investigating St. Jude for faulty batteries, and in the course of that investigation, some combination of the faulty batteries, which was not cyber, and the fact that St. Jude knew of these flaws in a 3-digit universal access code for years and never told the regulator that they had been aware of this security flaw, they got sanctioned, and the sanction's really bad. Not only is that one product sanctioned for 5 years, that company is sanctioned for 5 years. They couldn't bring new products to market for 5 years.
Wow.
I mean, that puts
Well,
somebody
that's
out
a
of
stick.
business.
That's
depending
what
on
we
who it
call
is.
negative reinforcement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty heavy hammer, and it's a
Mhm.
trust a lot. That they're a very trusting regulator, but if you get caught lying, you're in trouble, big time. So I don't know what the SEC, if they would rule on this, but we know the right people to ask. But the idea of you need to look more in your products and you need to do something when you find more. You have to look more and fix the things you find based on the actions they've taken thus far. I think someone like this product manufacturer, I don't know if they're publicly traded or not. So the SEC only handles publicly traded, but they might look at that as you withheld risks in your product, both from your investors and your customers.
I want to go back to silent patching for a moment and talk about the argument that's always brought forth to the table when they silently patch something. They say, well, even if we told you there was a vulnerability in it and we released a patch, whether it is a CVE or not, right? If we said this is a security update, well, someone would have to reverse engineer the patch. And that's a highly specialized skill and really, really super hard. I don't buy it.
Yeah, everybody can break weak crypto either.
I've covered this for 19 years, and I can tell you the amount of articles that I've read on reverse engineering a patch is totally possible. Like it's not easy. Don't get me wrong. It's not easy.
No.
But people with the right skill set exist and do it and write about it, and more people learn. And that's continued over time, that we know how to reverse engineer patches. It's table stakes. I've seen it recently in cases of Fortinet in their FortiGuard products. I've seen it in a number of even recent cases.
Well, I'll take this topic to some people I know.
It's an interesting one.
And you'll report back to us.
Again, the importance here, look, and I'm not trying to throw stones at anyone. I'm not, also I don't want to look like I'm knocking NIST or whatever. I'm not trying to knock everyone. I wanted to get us to a better place. In my big argument in the context of the JetBrains Rapid7 that we're talking about is I want the trackability, the accountability almost, so that we can track it as things change. If we don't assign something to it to recognize that this software in this version, in this configuration has a particular flaw, look, fix it, don't fix it. That's a whole other conversation, right? But I need the traceability that this exists for a whole host of reasons.
Which begs the rhetorical question, in my opinion, my article number 1. If companies are so focused on cybersecurity, why are data breaches still rising? The article talks about 188 billion spent on cybersecurity in 2023, estimated 215 billion in 2024, and yet breaches are on the rise. Why?
Because they haven't got to the base level yet. I mean, it's like you started with, we don't spend anything on this.
Right.
It doesn't exist, and people were getting hacked. Okay, well, now we started spending more money. We've started documenting more things. This stuff's more accessible. And there's a ceiling on it, but you aren't there yet. And so there's some minimal level of expenditure you're going to have to put in order to get this thing to level off. And until you get there, people, because they're doing it incrementally, nobody wants to say, oh, let's just fix all the problems. We don't care however much money it takes, we're going to spend it. They're all going, oh, I don't know. We're going to keep that budget under control. And it just sort of slowly creeps up toward that baseline. And eventually I think you get there, but who knows where that is.
And we could easily run the mistake in this conversation of assuming the only way to get popped is through vulnerabilities, which we know isn't true.
Right.
It's not even the most dominant way to get popped, but it's if you
technical vulnerabilities.
Sure.
Let's qualify that.
And
Hey, Jason, I got a guy from support on the phone. He wants to reset your password. Is that okay?
from password 1 to password 2. And the thing I keep hammering for way too long now, I'm going to be that guy telling you get off my lawn, is I said to the healthcare people in 2016, I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. And the only regulation we have in hospitals is to keep the PHI, the confidentiality of data, safe through HIPAA and OCR.
Not even safe, not able to associate with you.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's and that's
Right.
subtly different, but significantly different.
Not going to debate it. My point to them was there's 4 things that hospitals have to do according to national critical functions. They have to protect sensitive information, which they're doing badly, but they're doing it. The other 3 are ignored, which is number 2 is called maintain access to medical records, which is the availability of the EMR EHR. There's no regulation
Achilles heel of
to keep
security.
it available. None.
Yep.
Number 3 is provide medical care. So can your family get access to care when and where you need it? And when the hospital shut down, they're failing at that increasingly. And number 4 is support community health, which is make sure that your community has enough hospitals. Even if one goes down, there's other ones. But all the financial ruin from these attacks are killing off hospitals. So we're suffering on all 3 of the 3 neglected ones are where the attention and light should be. And right now they're still saying the only hammer they have is the HIPAA one. So every time, I just heard a children's hospital on NPR this week, his statement was in abundance of caution and in accordance with industry best practices, when we learned that we may have been compromised, we shut things down. And my head exploded because the act of shutting it down took a fine for PHI that you've already lost 5 times. It prioritized that fine over the ability to give surgeries, the ability to care for patients, the ability to keep your hospital solvent. And they're really hurting now by the choice that they were told prioritize data over safety. So yes, of course, we're having data breaches on the rise. I would rather, if I had a choice, keep people alive than. So
I want to go back, Jeff. I got some comments on your question there. So if we're getting better, this is a question that I hear a lot from just the customers that I work with. But what is the right amount of cybersecurity budget? So let's just assume that there is some, right? And most companies, small, medium-sized companies, they're and almost, Josh, to like what you were talking about earlier, they're cash starved, right? They don't have a lot of money, but at what point, like, okay, so and let's just put a monetary figure on it. Is it 1% or is it 10% of your yearly, your yearly revenue that you need to spend on cybersecurity? And are you ever secure? Like, so what if it's 50? What if you spend every dollar that you make on cyber? Are you secure? The answer is no, right? I mean, you're definitely better than you were before, but I really think what it really comes down to, why do companies continue to get, popped, It's because as cybersecurity researchers, the research is just outpacing the defense, right? And so I think about, just
let me correct
let's
you
go.
real quick. I don't think we're outpacing the defense. I think we're outpacing the mitigation.
Oh, actually, that's fine. I'll give you that. But let's go back a ways. Let's go back when we first started discovering things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, and like those were the hot, right? Like, and then all of a sudden comes just a wave of different types of flaws that are web application focused, right? It's because the security researchers started looking at they started focusing there, they started putting more effort there, and every time a new flaw is discovered, right? Let me say this a different way. Every time a new class of flaw is discovered, all that does is, and it's a great thing, right? So as a defender myself, I love when those things are solved, because kind of what you're talking about earlier, Paul, like tracking and all of those kind of things. But you can bet once that new class of flaw is discovered, there will be additional research that happens on top of that, right? So I feel like it's those two things that are competing against each other. And so while you may say we're outpacing the mitigations, we also have to consider how much companies are of their percentage wise of their budget they're willing to spend on cybersecurity, and weigh that against the risk, just the overall risk of the company, right? And so
Well, I think I think you have to acquire things that have less of an attack surface, right? Is what we're talking about, especially as an SMB. You go out and you acquire something that's got a million holes in it, versus you could acquire a different thing and it's got less holes in it. We're not basing the decisions on reducing our attack surface. I mean,
Yeah,
and also you
but
gotta have a strategy that allows you to be resilient without knowing what those bug classes or attack classes are or will be in the future. Because I agree, Bill, to your point, research is outpacing defense and mitigations right now. Because I bet you every single one of us on this podcast right now knows about some kind of flaw or vulnerability that hasn't been released yet. At least one thing. At least one thing you're like, this hasn't come to fruition yet, but I know about it.
But the reason I made the distinction with what Bill was saying was, most of us would agree, and most people that are seasoned veterans in this industry agree, that technology doesn't solve the problem.
I like seasoned
there's
veterans
so much
versus old.
Oh, yeah. I like it too. We all agree that it's more than just the technology, and yet there's this large group of entities, organizations out there that they kind of have to rely on whatever it is that they're using, having some reasonable explanation that what they're using is secure. And I think that's part of the problem, because security, in essence, to me, is the monitoring and the defense and catching the bad things and thwarting it, not fixing everything that they could be exploiting.
Like my defense, when there's four of us smoking in here, is going to be wear goggles.
but Paul said the magic word, because resilience. Okay.
Oh, I did that just for you, Josh.
Fine. But most of us can suffer and tolerate breaches, many breaches, and not go out of business and not even have big layoffs. Like, they're tolerable. We're now entering, for the last 5 years or so, we have entered the world of harms that can't be absorbed and tolerated very easily. They're much higher consequences. That old saw, perhaps you said it even in the last 2 weeks, of no one's gone out of business because of a cyber event. Not true anymore.
No.
Tons of hospitals are gone. So it's not that their stock price got hit. So to me, it's like every time I testify, it's some version of the following. So I'll say 2 or 3 of them right now fast. When I launched the Cavalry, I said our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it. The word I used was dependence. Later in my testimonies, I would say, through our over-dependence on undependable things, we have created the conditions that accidents and adversaries can have a profound impact on public safety. And in the executive order that I helped with, the EO one, I got a line in there that said, in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences we will incur if that trust is misplaced. So to me, it's not that you can't do business. It's that given how much the cost of wrong is, you have to have a higher level of trustworthiness, transparency, dependability for the software, tech, firmware, hardware that you use for something that's going to keep people alive or could put you out of business
Right.
versus the things
Mhm.
that embarrass you or cost you a fine.
Fair.
And I think
Right.
if you zoom out at most enterprise security best practices, it's mostly confidentiality data on things that even if you get popped, you'll still be okay.
Right.
And in our neglect of the things that need resilience, that need proportional dependence, we've given a false confidence to these
It's
people.
the neglect of availability, and it's coming to a head with hospitals and ransomware.
Yeah, and we shouldn't
Yeah.
forget integrity sometimes too, but it's that make sure that we right size the dependence and the dependability versus the consequences, and we are doing a terrible job at that.
Right.
Well, we've also got to prioritize and fund it. I mean, hospitals are margins that are ridiculously thin. I mean, not just recently, like years ago, a new hospital would be built, and then a couple years later, you find out they're selling the building because they can't afford to keep it themselves. They're going to stay there, but it's cheaper for them to lease it.
Mhm.
Small businesses clearly don't have huge cyber budgets. Even in the gov space, when EO 14028 came out, we estimated just for our site about 20 something million to implement it. The available Congress funding for it was
Zero.
It was cost of business. I'm sorry, we're sponsor funded. They're expecting us to deliver on their projects.
I'm gonna
They
go
don't
on
have a lot of
go,
tolerance for that.
I'm going on a limb and say that cybersecurity is unique to a lot of other industries or analogies that we put forth. We talked about car wheels. We talk about supply chain. We
Mhm.
talk about food.
Fire suppression systems.
Like the list of analogies goes on.
Airbags.
There's
Right.
so many nuances in what we do with technology, and it changes so fast that it puts
Yes.
us at a complete disadvantage. I'll give you an example. My story number 8.
Ooh.
This is a nuance, right? And then we're going back to our good friend Daniel at the Curl Project, right? And this is some of also what we rely on is like the one person
I know.
that
Yeah.
makes the thing that we like so many of us rely on. And Curl is that. And I love Daniel to death because Curl is an amazing tool and he's done an amazing job of maintaining it. And he realized recently, this is reason number 527 why I don't use Apple, that when you use the CA cert, command line parameter to curl, what it's supposed to do is allow you to specify which CAs you trust, right? And in all other systems, it overrides whatever CA your operating system trusts by default. If you specify it, it goes, this is the list the user specified. I'm not trusting any other CAs and what the user told me, except on Apple. Apple goes, well, if you didn't find anything in what the user provided you, fall back to what's on the system because we're Apple and we want to help you and we know we provided a great list. And Daniel's like, this is a vulnerability. This means if in what you've specified, if it doesn't validate the cert, it should fail. The user's expecting it to fail. Apple falls back to the system store. Apple's like, to your point earlier, Bill, Apple's like, everything's fine. This is fine. It's that meme when the building's on fire and the girl's smiling. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Or no, that's not the meme. There's another meme with fire, where the cartoon is sitting in the fire. Everything's fine. Apple's like, everything's fine. I'm fine. Bill, how you doing? I'm fine. I'm fine. Fine. My curl command worked totally fine. It's not fine.
We're all
It's these
fine here.
nuances.
Everything's fine.
It's these nuances. Again, in all my years covering this industry, that I hear all the analogies and all the things that other industries are doing. These nuances.
Well, so
Are
what's
we unique
interesting-
snowflakes, or am I overstating it?
One area where unique snowflake is we don't put liability on the person that passes risk downstream. Like if you were responsible for the risks you put out in the universe, you would put less risk into the universe.
Right.
At every
Mhm.
step.
But that
it.
could be a detriment too.
It will be disruptive, but you would see better choices where there's less. David Rice, did we ever talk about him? He wrote the book Geekonomics.
Yeah.
It was the true
David.
cost of
Yeah,
insecure
I know
software.
David. Yeah.
Genius, right?
He's awesome. Yeah.
He can't talk in public much anymore, but one of the private talks he gave.
Does he work for Apple?
He does.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the talks he gave recently was he likened cybersecurity and vulnerabilities to pollution and trash islands. And I'm not going to do the whole analogy justice, but we have an island of trash in the ocean, right? And
Right.
the approach we're taking in this metaphor is So the trash is just a byproduct of making stuff, right? There's going to be some trash and some
Mhm.
waste no matter what you do. Even, I think he said, even wind turbines for green energy have waste that you can't get rid of, right?
Right.
So there's always some trash. And his point is, we spend our time having volunteer armies go to the beach and pick up trash, or we track trash movements in the ocean. And then sometimes the rich people will make a tractor to get trash picked up quicker than just, a volunteer army. But no one ever says, can we maybe put a little bit less trash in the ocean? Like, we
Mhm.
never go upstream to what's the source
Mhm.
of the pollution.
That's
And
crazy talk.
so,
What are you saying? We go to developers?
That's un-American.
no, not individual developers, but final goods assemblers who make money,
Mhm.
and they can bake it into the
Mhm.
cost. And in economics, there's an economic theory called, markets want to be efficient, right?
Mhm.
And the way they're efficient is you reveal the true cost, and you put the cost burden on the least cost of order. What that means is, if some product, Acme was selling stuff for $100, that's the cost. But if you have to spend $50 to secure it and $25 for insurance, and then another $25 when you fail to protect it, the true cost is not $100. It's 100 plus 50 plus 25
Mhm.
plus 25. So
Yeah.
that's your true cost. Now the market wants to be efficient, so there's a lot of waste there. If you put the cost burden on Acme, the cost of goods might go up to $110,
Mhm.
but you just saved $90 in the system, and that $90 can buy the second product from Acme.
Right.
So
Mm.
most economists I talk to think the lack of liability is the most diseconomic thing we could possibly do.
Interesting.
So
Hmm.
one way we're unique is we're relying on volunteer firefighters and volunteer trash picker
Yeah.
uppers, and the people that can afford a tractor have a little bit less vulnerabilities in their enterprise. The people who can't afford it are going out of business, like hospitals. So I'm not pro punishing innovation. I think the only efficient way to identify and buy down risk is to put the risk burden on the person in the best position to avoid it.
Hmm.
Which throughout that big chain, everybody cuts it down, and now instead of like this much risk leaking out, we have this much risk leaking out. And if someone wants to be a bad actor and say, we'll roll the dice, and we think we can get away with using Apache Struts 1 for another 10 years, then let them.
But that's not happening because it's not economically in their best
It's
interest
because-
today to do that.
It's because the people with the most lobbying dollars hate the idea.
Yep.
But
Okay.
as I indicated, I think we're like a couple of years away from it in Europe. And if you want to sell in Europe, which most of our companies sell globally, then you just have to look at your forecast and say, if we don't do this, we can't sell in Europe.
But how does that impact open source?
So the way that CRA handled this is the
There
open
was
source
it was a big hoopla about
the
that. with
open source
CRA,
community
yeah.
lost their mind with CRA. Now the US had already figured out we're going to put this on the final goods assembler from McPherson versus Buick
Mhm.
in 1917. So the language has now gotten to a place where the open source community is happy with it. So individual open source contributors and projects are not covered by CRA. Final goods assemblers are. And there's a small provision in between, which is if you're like Maven or Apache Foundation or Linux Foundation, you're technically in the bounds, but your fine would be $0. So they really shifted the onus and accountability and responsibility to commercial entities selling goods, final goods.
Not to be cynical, but are the final
Goods
goods
assemblers.
assemblers.
those guys, are they going to find a loophole and find a way to push the things that make them liable to upstream one or two steps so that they're not technically legally the
Well, if the good that
responsible?
hurt the customer in Europe was sold by you, you're going to be accountable for it.
Okay.
Yeah, because in open source last year,
Mhm.
Bob Martin described open source as like a rock.
A rock.
A rock laying on the ground. Anyone can pick up the rocks. You can use it however you want to use it. There's no warranty, no guarantee with the rock. I think it was Brian Bellendorf, also from Linux. He's from the Linux Foundation.
Mhm.
Said it's more like a head of cabbage, right? And you just, they're laying on the ground and you can go pick them up. But like, if you don't take care of it, eventually they rot. There's some interesting analogies with open source, and what I think is all in the back of our minds that we don't want to disrupt, because every single one of us on the show and listening relies on open source software
It's
in
everywhere.
some way, shape, form, or fashion. Whether you know it or not, you rely on it, and we don't want to disrupt that ecosystem.
What's our show
You don't.
about to be pushed out on, at least in part? Open source.
Open source. Open source is
Yeah.
everywhere.
So no one wants to chill, discourage, deter volunteer open source committers. Nobody. And CRA was a little loose in the language at first, and they fixed it to the
Mhm.
point where most of the zealots are very happy with it now. But what it could do for final goods assemblers, if you're using an old dead project that no one maintains, like you might want to migrate to a more sustained.
You should be
higher
responsible for
assurance.
that, not the person that wrote it. The person that wrote it's like, I was inspired for a weekend and I wrote the stuff and I put it out there, and then like I lost interest and I moved on to something else. If you put that in your product, that's on you. That's not on me.
And there's some open source projects that are incredibly well maintained.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, the Linux kernel is the shining example, which is also now a CNA, which is
It
interesting.
is now a CNA. That's
Does that change? I don't know. Does
that's kind of how this NVD thing came to a head.
it really?
It was one of the things that pushed it over the edge.
Interesting. Because they were frustrated. Is that why they became a CNA? Were they frustrated?
I don't know why they became a CNA. I think it's a good thing though.
Is it though? So do we need more CNAs? Does
We
everyone
need
need to be
more CNAs?
but does everyone need to be their own CNA? How many think about how many people in organizations write software today? Does every single one of them need to be a CNA and be responsible for assigning their own CVEs? That's the extreme.
Every person, no.
Every organization?
I think a lot of these, I was part of a project that Harvard did with the Linux Foundation called the Census, the Census 2. We looked at the most dependent upon open source projects in the world. So the most, not how many projects are there, but the ones everybody needs and uses, either directly or indirectly. So those highly dependent upon projects are a good place to start for, do you have a
The
CNA?
CNACCs, sort of?
By the way, I have to say this every time I say CNA. I forgot earlier. There's a special place in hell for people who put an acronym inside of an acronym. CVE naming authority.
Probably an acronym for that.
Yeah. But we definitely need more CNAs, and specifically, we're really anemic on CNAs in open source and CNAs in cyber physical systems like OT.
But who should determine whether it's a vulnerability? The person that created it, the person reporting it, and how does that process work?
I'm not the expert on the ideal use of CNAs, but often, increasingly, now that one of the things the Cavalry is really proud of, we didn't do it single-handedly, but we really helped decriminalize or destigmatize good faith research, right? Coordinated vulnerability disclosure for every federal agency now. It's in the law, the Land for Patch Act. Like, we have carve-outs in DMCA and CFAA, DOJ guidance saying don't prosecute hackers acting in good faith. So with more of those, like my point is, with more of those, there's more triggers to find them, and in the course of that handshake of finding them, it could be cert CC sometimes writes them when the vendor won't. The bug finder can write them.
But here's my thing: like the Linux kernel, and Greg is the person for the Linux kernel, right? Like there's literally a person named Greg, and he's the person for the Linux kernel that he's the guy that leads the charge that someone reports a bug and or a vulnerability, and he and his team are making the determination: is it a bug? Is it a vulnerability? If it's a vulnerability, now they're a CNA, they assign a CVE to it, right? And Larry even said that they're leaning more towards assigning CVEs to things that are bugs, which is fine. It's almost irrelevant, because what Greg said on his interview in the Open Source Security podcast, which was amazing, by the way, everyone should go listen to it. He said, look, at the end of the day, you can use the Linux kernel. You can not use the Linux kernel. I don't care. I can make this a bug. I can make this a vulnerability. I have no incentive to really go either way. I think genuinely they're evaluating and going, yeah, that's a vulnerability, right? And if you're evaluating that process and he's like, you can use it or you can not use it. I don't care. You agree or disagree with my assignment of a vulnerability or a bug. I don't care, because I don't care if you use it or not, because they're an open source project. They're not a commercial entity. Where I think we have a real debate in this industry is, if you're a commercial entity and you're a CNA and you're making the determination, does this get a CV or not?
Yeah.
That's when you're inherently biased.
So I always had heebie-jeebies of like a vendor who wanted to hide their bug until a security researcher forced it into the light, and then they get to score their own and do their own write-up with their own level of verbosity. I thought that was a bit of a conflict of interest.
I also think that most of the time we end up with a good outcome. Even, look, I've interviewed people from Microsoft. Jared DeMott's a shining example. He's like, look, if you disagree with our decision, give me more details. Push on a little bit. Give me more details, and we'll work with you on that. And I think Microsoft has done a great job. I think they did catch a lot of flack, but they also own the most lines of source code out of any commercial entity. right? So like you got to take that into account when you use Microsoft as an example. But I think in general, people do want to do the right thing. But it's those cases where the right thing doesn't happen that worries me.
I don't know the stats on this, but some ISACs or sectors are
Mhm.
making CNAs for the sector.
Mhm.
In fact, in some of these sectors, a very large percentage of the equipment used in hospitals are out of business. There is no vendor to make a to make a CVE for them.
Mhm. Yep.
So there are people that are making, regional CNAs or sector specific CNAs. What I do know is the vulns are growing faster than CNAs are, so we need more CNAs. I don't love the governance process, and I know some CNAs are better at it than others. And maybe that's part of this big fight we're having is how to make sure that that scales properly too, or how there's some checks and balances in scoring or CNA stuff.
Right, but that gets dicey though. It gets back to, should anyone be able to advocate and get a CVE, or what are the checks and balances? And that is like truly the double-edged sword that worries me the most in this vulnerability management process, right? We don't want to have a situation somewhat like where we are today, where anyone can get a CVE assigned, whether it's a vulnerability or not. But we don't want to go to the other side where there's so much scrutiny
Mhm.
that vulnerabilities don't get disclosed, don't get tracked, don't get publicized. We have to land somewhere in the middle. Now, I don't know that I'm advocating for candidates like we had back in the day. Remember CVE candidates,
Mm.
early days of CVE,
Mhm.
you could put in for a CVE and it would be like, it's a candidate, like we're reviewing it. But I think that was a day and age where we had a lot less software, we had a lot less vulnerabilities, and we could afford the luxury of going, yeah, it's candidate. Like you might have a vulnerability or not, and we're gonna debate it, we're gonna talk about it and then figure it out. We don't have the time or the luxury of that today, no?
But these,
No.
to state the obvious,
You
these
compare
flaws,
the. Go ahead.
just
Go
to
ahead.
state the obvious, these flaws exist whether we have a CVE for them or not. So
Right.
adversaries can take advantage of them with or without them coming to light.
Mm-hmm.
The whole point of the CNA and CVE and scoring and KEVs is to give the defenders some parity with what
Right,
the adversaries
right.
know. So this there's lots of competing instincts and equities in what the good guys do, but generally speaking, doing this and doing it well at scale benefits defenders.
Correct.
So whenever we
Mhm.
fight amongst ourselves, we're advantaging adversaries.
That's well said.
Sorry, who did I interrupt?
Nothing more needs to be said on this
Okay.
subject right now,
Except for what Lee has to
Well,
except for what Lee has to say.
Well, I was thinking of they're also they have these submitted CVEs that don't have a lot of details. I run into these when I'm looking through the Apple security updates when they put out their thing for iOS, and I'm trying to figure out what the risks are for deploying it. And I go clicking on the CVEs, and it's just a placeholder.
Uh.
Um, I mean, very little data, and I have to look at the likelihood of exploit and the device risks and all that. I have to make a more a less informed decision than I'd like, but I still think we got some spots where they can hold them.
But
And by the way,
Lee,
Josh,
I just want that you bring up an outstanding point, and one that I will also address in my talk is that where's the bar or the standard for what information,
Minimum
how
viable.
much
Yeah.
how much detail should be included in a CVE today? Because I think we're in a place today where it can be incredibly detailed, or it can be no detail at all, or somewhere in between, but there's a CVE number associated with it, and that's not really helping us either.
Well, that goes back
Yeah,
to
no,
the
it-
technical
it-
detail or not.
Well, and it
Right.
goes back to resources. I think we talked about funding and all that stuff too. Who's filling out all of these details right now? There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen
Mhm.
filling out
and the
these,
scores
or not,
and
right?
the scores suck in a lot of
And the
cases.
scores do suck. Yeah.
yeah. By the way, Josh, I did make up a new acronym in favor of your comment about making up acronyms.
Oh, good.
SPHFAG, a special place in hell for acronym
Oh,
generators.
there you go.
There you go. It's
I'm
great.
from the government. I'm here to help.
Mm.
Oh boy. I want to just.
I
I
know.
want to.
I've
I
got
want to
it
just
zoning now.
transition into something that it holds a special place in my heart, and that I've been tracking a lot lately. And Larry and I have been talking. Like, there's so many new Bluetooth vulnerabilities and exploit kind of frameworks that, like, I'm running out of time. Like, I literally need to take a vacation and just mess around with a whole bunch of gear and a whole bunch of GitHub repositories to make all this stuff work and figure out like what the
Mhm.
speaking of risk and vulnerability management, like figure out what the risks are to these vulnerabilities. And some of them have CVEs, some of them don't. My story number 10 is Blue Spy. This is a company that actually created a framework for evaluating Bluetooth technology and then applied that framework and found a vulnerability and then put up a GitHub with some tooling that allows you to exploit that vulnerability, which essentially 30,000 foot view lets you snoop on someone's headset. Josh Wright did this 20 years ago at a
Right.
SANS conference, right? And I was like, well, that's bad. And now we're in the same position 20 years later where I'm like, wow, that could be really bad. And I haven't dug into all the details, but like I like how they call out my favorite distribution, Arch Linux. They've been used to install all these tools and have an audio server that's used to record the playback and capture the audio from Bluetooth headsets. And just like the pace that I've seen this happen is somewhat concerning, because when we first started looking into Bluetooth stuff, it was like just coming about. We've had the first, remember the early Bluetooth headsets that had like the thing that wrapped around your ear? It was like the elongated thing, and those were really vulnerable. And I remember Josh Wright doing a lot of research on that. And there was the car thing. So Bluetooth for the first time was in vehicles. And I remember our beloved Twitchy years ago on the show did an exercise. We wouldn't even say it's Twitchy. Our friend Bob, Twitchy talked to Bob, and Bob did this exercise where Bob was at a coffee shop and injected audio into a vehicle that was in the parking lot that may or may not have had children in it that reacted to the audio that was played in said car. And this is close to 20 years ago now. And we're still in the same spot when it comes to Bluetooth.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were going to make a different point, which is what I'm having in policy land, which is I could spend all day, every day reading a new policy proposal or a new request for comment for this. Like it's just so much stuff now we can't keep up. So new vuln techniques, new exploit techniques, new stories. Like we're getting to the point where we're not scaling very well.
Right.
So I thought that's where you were going, but
no, but it's a great point, Josh.
I think we've been at that point for quite a while.
A while. Like I'm just noticing it in this one very specific sector, that the Apple BLE spam, that the story we covered last week where someone built an AI model to detect Reggaeton and then DOS the Bluetooth speaker based on that. And like the hits keep coming. Also, I listened to Reggaeton and it's not for me. As an exercise, I was like, I got to see what the person was getting at. I'm like, oh, now I know why you took like probably 100 hours and went on this project to kill that music. Because I'm like, I'm not digging it. It's not for me. I mean, it might be for some. That's fine. Everyone's different musical taste, but I was like, yeah, not for me.
I get the feeling because the Bluetooth is like recurring Bluetooth weaknesses. Somewhere I think that somebody is deciding really it's not worth the risk to make it super secure versus the consumer appeal. And we all have our Bluetooth hacking device right here.
Absolutely. It has some capabilities in Bluetooth.
Don't bring that to Canada.
That's right. You'll be in one of those Canadian prisons, and you know what happens there. They're very polite to you and make you eat French fries with gravy.
I think they give you Tim
Tim
Hortons. Yeah.
Yes, that's what that is.
Oh boy, Bill, did you see this Blue Spy one?
Yeah, I was hoping that we were going to get to it because you kind of already mentioned everything I wanted to talk about. It certainly is a trend. This was a GitHub repo that I did fork right away.
Nice.
When I saw it. Mainly just in case it disappears next week, right? Like I want to still be able to play with it when I get to it on my list of projects. So maybe 20 years from now, we'll give that a run. Yeah.
It's like I know where Larry's coming from now when he says my projects have projects,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And also like the hardware to do all of this is just there's a plethora of it. I'm just always, good Lord, it's a rabbit hole, right? Like I needed to order. Bill, I sent you this stuff, right? The reason I ordered those ESP32s that were on a PCB that had a screen on it, because I needed a serial cable that was $2.97 for my Raspberry Pi 5 because it has a special UART connector on it now. And I'm like, what is that cable? And like, props to Adafruit. I think I put this on my socials this week. I was like, Adafruit had a whole YouTube video where she went into like amazing detail. She's like, hey, if you've got a Raspberry Pi 5 and you're trying to figure this out and you need this connector and you're like puzzled because you looked at it and like, what is that? I'm like, yes, that is me. Please tell me. And she's like, you need to order this cable from here. And so I go to, I think it was DigiKey, and I'm like, all right, $2.97. I'm like, we'll get 2 of them. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to pay just as much for shipping as I am for these 2 little cables. And I'm like, what else can I order? So I'm like, well, let me ESP32. I'm like, oh, Bill was playing around with one of those boards. I'm like, all right, well, give me 2 more. I'm like, $80 later. So $2.97 turns into $80. And then you do the same thing to me.
But you got free shipping at some point.
Then
right?
Bill's like, no, the actual board I got was this board, and it was $13 on AliExpress. And I'm like, well, I can't just spend $13 on AliExpress because then I'm going to pay like $10 in shipping. Like, I got to order. I'm like, and AliExpress is amazing because like the things I've been shopping for on Amazon and thinking about buying, you can sometimes find for fractions of the cost on AliExpress, and it's hit or miss. It's like gambling. Like this is a problem. Like this could be a problem. And I'm like, all right,
we're gonna launch a new segment.
Yeah, I want a foldable Bluetooth keyboard that I can connect to my Raspberry Pi and have like a small little display for my Raspberry Pi to have like a thing I can travel with. I'm like, all right, $13.97 for the Bluetooth keyboard. That was $30 on Amazon. I'm like, what a bargain. And so that was a $56 order.
So you're going to end
some
up
other bits that
you're going to end up like Lou, because when I was going through Lou's stuff, I was like, why did Lou buy like 36 of these transformers when he needed one? And then I was like, oh, free shipping.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you spent $100 on stuff you don't need because you didn't want to spend $9 on the shipping, and now you've got 36 of these things.
At least I have something. At least I have.
I'm the more you spend, the more you save. It's
Paul, you're going to need to expand your workshop to hold all this stuff.
Yes, you are.
That's right.
A place somewhere in Warwick that's going to be up where you can assume the lease and maybe store some stuff.
There's a blimp hangar down there that I think at Quonset that. Yeah.
Right. We might need. Yeah. Acquiring more space.
It's going to be like that Jamie guy on Mythbusters, where he's just got like, it's stacked like 4 stories high of all these little drawers that have like everything that ever existed and then some.
Well, just watch the online ads from Maynard's. I'm sure they have a sale on a shed that's going to be 11% discounted, or giving an 11% coupon.
If you buy 2, it's free shipping.
That's right.
There's a pad right next door. Maybe that's up for lease.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, where the Pizza Hut was. Yeah,
you could build something up there.
Paul Central.
We're real supportive, Paul.
Maybe
it's enabler. I'm not sure which.
I need space. You guys are just enabling me. Like,
we're codependent here.
I did also. I
see Paul buy it, and I go buy one too.
Well, I don't know if did you buy a Bus Pirate 5?
No, I have not bought that yet, but I want to.
Like,
I have it up on one of my screens right now.
I gotta tell you, like, functionality aside, which is there. Don't get me wrong, and like it's still early stage. Like, you got to get the firmware updates from like a forum post that makes like daily posts for like the new firmware. But the Bus Pirate 5 has a little LED display, and it tells you the voltage on every pin on that display. And as a bonus, has LED lights that are programmable. So it's a Raspberry Pi 2040 is the brains behind it.
So
and it's a very nice thing.
Do you have to buy for free shipping?
No, I bought one of those, but I bought all the cable connection kits that go with it, which they're totally like, they're amazing. The cable connection kits are amazing because I get into this problem where you solder a pin header on a board, and there's different. The width between the pins is different. Mm-hmm. I want to say the standard UART is 3.5 millimeter. Is that right, Bill?
I don't know.
And then there's a smaller one that's 2.5 millimeter. and I had one that was 2.5 millimeter. And if you get the square plastic connectors on the end of your serial pin connections on your 2-punt cables, it like doesn't fit on the smaller pin heads. But the Bus Pirate has the heat shrink, just circular connector on it, and so it'll fit on the 2.5. So it's pretty awesome. So Bus Pirate 5, I'm doing some stuff.
I'm gonna go out on a limb, Paul, and try to pull you back to news stories.
Oh, yeah.
Lee and I each had a story about the IMF.
What is that background noise? You guys hear the background noise?
I hear a hum.
Or is it just me?
Yeah, it's in there.
There's a loud hiss.
There is a hiss happening. My story number 3, Lee's story number 6. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, revealed that their, I think it was 11 email accounts were hacked.
Yep. And they're all in 365, and they claim they fixed the security.
They resecured them.
Oh, I like that term. Resecured. I secured it, then it wasn't secure, so I resecured it.
They resecured it, which means they changed the password.
If you resecure stuff, you don't need MFA.
Maybe they added MFA.
It's resecured.
Right.
But
I'm thinking I was actually thinking that somebody had done something like MFA, and these were the 11 exclusions because of special reason that didn't have it. Because I run into the special snowflake argument, and it drives me crazy. It's like, no, you all need to have it. You'll cope.
And it's always the ones that need it the most, right? Like it's always the VIP that says, I don't want the MFA, right?
Well, I don't know if Lee and I pointed to the same article. I think my article said, whoever the director or leader of IMF, their account, they said that's not the account, one of the accounts.
No, it wasn't the
directors or whatever.
Yeah, it wasn't those senior employees, but it was still 11. And I'm just still thinking they were just somehow were accepted and had weird policies on them.
Well, so all the things we've been talking about from Josh's segment on, and then we got this issue with email security and email accounts getting compromised, probably not by a CVE related vulnerability.
You mean because of the PEBCAC?
Or maybe it's one of your 3 must do's.
The bad practices.
The bad practices. How much of this goes away if those 3 bad practices were followed by everybody?
We aimed really narrowly so that they would be beyond reproach, hard to debate. So we did not say that they had coverage for all things. We just said, if you're hit this way, you might face loss of insurance, regulatory fines, lawsuits, trying to establish.
So you tried to incentivize them to at least do these 3 things. But we've talked for years about, all this stuff we do, and it all boils down to, what are the top 2 things, Paul? Password exploitation and exploitation of trust relationships.
I'd say, one of the early episodes on this podcast, I was quoted as saying, misconfiguration leads to compromise.
Yep.
And it speaks to your password. You could also lump that into authentication.
Yeah.
Misconfiguration in your authentication schemes and processes could lead to compromise, but also the way you configure your systems, which is kind of independent of a
and
software vulnerability.
There's the rub.
It's
because what happens often, or not, not that we don't need to do all this stuff we're talking about in terms of patching and fixing the vulnerabilities and finding the vulnerabilities, but the bad guys still find a way. And it's usually something very...
But I bring this up in the context of Secure Boot as an example, right? Where, yes, there's flaws in UEFI software. Those are your traditional vulnerabilities. We've seen logo fail, pixie fail, right? But it's also that misconfiguration. Is Secure Boot enabled or not? Like, that doesn't have a CVE associated with it. That's a misconfiguration in your environment that could allow an attacker to compromise your system. There's also another kind of class of vulnerabilities that I've talked about before. That is you've lost your root of trust. someone lost a key or certificate, like how does that impact critical infrastructure, Josh, that we talked about? Like we kind of focused it on the like misconfiguration of software vulnerabilities, those kind of things, but it can impact any system at any time if that root of trust can be broken. It may require initial access, but we all know that could be a relatively easy thing. But if you can abuse the root of trust because someone lost a key completely out of your control, right? Like MSI had a huge leak. Conceivably lost, keys. Now, fortunately for us, a lot of those keys were test keys and whatever. We haven't seen real attacks, but what if someone were to lose a key? If Intel and Microsoft hold keys that, if leaked, could lead to a bad day for everyone, and it would be like a really, really bad day.
Back to proportionality.
Yeah, like that's when we talk. You talked earlier, Josh, about like key, not just industries, but key players in those industries.
Yeah. Systemically important entities.
Linchpins, I'll call them, right? There are also linchpins in many of the things that we know and love and trust that are held by major corporations that, if they were to be leaked, would be a bad day for everyone. And there's nothing we can necessarily do to mitigate that risk other than raise awareness and put trust in vendors like Microsoft and Intel to protect that root of trust, right? Which thankfully they've done really well.
Or you start doing the security things, which I think the root of security is the monitoring and being able to detect something weird's happening. Something's being used and abused and misused, and this is not normal, which I think to me is the essence of security. All this other stuff we're talking about.
We hope that we find it and that malicious actors don't find it.
If they do it, you catch them doing it.
We hope that someone with ethics reports that a key has been leaked and not a malicious actor finding it. We hope. But again, we have very little control over that scenario.
Well, and to compound the problem, the bad guys have learned, okay, the enterprises where the things that we used to steal a generation ago to monetize, we don't need to do that anymore. We can hit all these smaller entities, these starved entities. We don't even have to steal the data. We can just hold it hostage. Or it was mentioned in that article that I had earlier, in terms of why are breaches still happening. They cited ransomware, and they referred to it as ransomware 2.0. I heard.
Yeah, I read that.
I had a conversation earlier with somebody earlier.
Josh is like ransomware 2.0.
Well, it's not just ransomware. Okay, we're holding your data hostage, and we'll let it back to you if you pay us. It's we're holding your data hostage, and if you don't pay us, we're going to release it.
Yeah,
that's not new.
It's like hostageware.
That's not new.
It's not new, but they're categorizing.
Hold on. Along these lines, what's interesting, my story number 2, the UDP-based application protocols are vulnerable to network loops, right? When we talked about a lot about disrupting critical infrastructure. I think many of us in security somewhat dismiss the DOS attacks because it's not code execution. Too much. We dismiss those, right? We dismiss those. But you look at a protocol-based vulnerability that is systemic. It's in multiple vendors. Multiple vendors have not even acknowledged that they have this problem and therefore maybe are not addressing it. And we can see those in the, what do you call the CERT VU notes? What is that? That's what is the moniker? I recently started tracking these. When there's a big enough vulnerability that affects multiple vendors, US CERT will create a VU.
So it's like vendor independent?
US CERT's gone. Do you mean?
What is CERT.org?
CERT-CC?
Is that the new moniker for it? I'm old. I'm calling it US CERT is what you're saying.
US CERT was at DHS. CERT-CC was the country CERT.
US CERT predated.
So who owned Carnegie Mellon University owns CERT.org?
Yeah, that's CERT-CC.
Okay, CERT-CC.
Yeah.
They CERT Coordination Center, CERT-CC. Gotcha. Publishes notes.
Yes.
With the VU moniker. What does VU stand for?
I don't remember.
Is it the person
trying to Google it?
We could ask Art or Google it. Yeah.
And so So this is an implementation of a UDP-based application protocol attack
Vanderbilt University.
that can, I don't know,
think
that
that's
can,
Vulnerability
basic-
update, maybe?
maybe.
I don't
But so this tracks that there's a vulnerability in the UDP protocol. It can affect DNS, NTP, TFTP. For those old
It's
folks,
short for something called Vanuatu. That's what the V.
Vanuatu's in Fiji.
raise your hand if you're old and you remember Echo and Cargen. Yep. Okay. And quote of the day.
Cargen? Chargen.
Chargen, thank you. Quote of the day.
It's
RFC
like 5 and 7 or something like that?
865 QOTD were specifically found to be vulnerable to these network loops that they found in the UDP protocol. And this is a protocol definition in software that's existed for ages. But in a denial of service context, we're talking about critical infrastructure, totally in play.
So CERT VU is CERT Vanuatu. It's the Central Cybersecurity Information and Incident Response Hub for Vanuatu, whatever Vanuatu
Well,
is.
there's certs in most countries, so maybe that's just their
Is
cert.
Vanuatu a
Their
country?
cert, yeah.
Vanuatu is an island in like around
Okay.
Fiji.
Doug's knowledge of
Is that kind of like
geography
in,
is
back 30 years ago,
unprecedented.
the Australian CERT was the source of all information because they saw things first because they were in the future.
Yes.
Is Vanuatu like close to?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
okay.
right
They're
now,
on-
that makes sense.
This affects, according to this VU note, Broadcom, Cisco, Honeywell, Microsoft, and MikroTik.
So you got me thinking, like, one of the goals of the Census project for open source, combined with our desire to have SBOMs, so we can see who's using everything, who's using which things, is you can start to determine what's the systemically important open
Right.
source, right? And give them either funding or additional protection or additional scrutiny. So not exactly what you were saying, but some of these things are really far reaching. You know,
Yes.
network protocols should be on that list.
Right.
Class breaks should be on that list. Like,
All right. I'm translating CERT VU as OS CERT. It's
No, yeah.
geographic location. It's a particular CERT, but they see things earlier because they're in the future.
Well, you can go read vulnerability note VU 417980. It was released yesterday for the UDP protocol.
Or was it tomorrow? Because they're in the future.
Could be.
Yeah.
Anyway, Doug, you covered this story on the new attack that JavaScript inside of a browser can exploit speculative execution vulnerabilities in GPUs.
Yep.
wow.
Craziness.
Yeah, it was. It basically they said that on almost all the GPUs were vulnerable to it. That it was using that predictive speculation so that you could extract, security keys and things like that from, I guess, the protected memory on the GPU, and they had granted JavaScript the right to access the GPU directly because I guess it needs that to do certain calculations, when people load certain web pages. And so people were then using it to do malicious things. And yeah. It's
Well,
like,
there was a whole research paper. I didn't read it. My speculation, pun intended, is that some of it could relate to GPU acceleration that's used by the browser, which means the browser needs access to the hardware in order to do, probably through the graphics driver, obviously, to do the hardware acceleration. And I say this with a higher degree of confidence in the past couple of weeks because I have this issue on my new Framework 16 that runs Linux, where if Chrome gets overloaded, it starts to lag. And all things are pointing to the open source driver for AMD Radeon graphics that I haven't been able to untangle.
well, the driver
at
in
this
this
moment.
was called Web GPU.
That's interesting. So it could be something different
It could be something different.
other
in that
than
case.
hardware. It uses the hardware acceleration in the GPU because the browser takes up so much damn resources that it needs
that
that.
may be a different problem.
That could be different, but it's different from what this is
These guys
exploiting.
these guys were using the GPU. I think it was to process AES keys or something. It was a very heavy crunch kind of thing where I guess they didn't want to take up your CPU, so they're just going to use the unused GPU cycles, but that allowed them access.
Mhm.
And since they had access, they were doing those racetrack type attacks, which
Mhm.
then allowed them to break into the protected space and extract things.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So
Bad.
are GPUs typically on the graphics card, or are they part of the?
No, the GPU's on the graphics card. Yeah,
It's
I mean
on
it
the
could be
graphics
it could be on the motherboard if if it's a motherboard that has a
But
built-in.
typically
on the
it's-
processor, on the CPU.
I mean the GPU is its own CPU. It's it's really just a CPU, but it's a special purpose CPU.
Yeah, like I cover all the bases. So I have a framework 13 with an Intel i7 that has the Intel integrated graphics on the CPU.
Mhm.
Then I have a desktop that has an NVIDIA card in it. Then I have my framework 16, which is an AMD, and I got the graphics module, so it's an AMD Radeon graphics card built into the laptop. And so I find all the bugs. I have all the nuances across all the graphics.
Sounds like something your company should focus on. Kind of
No comment.
Firmware, hardware, kind of related. Fair enough.
Any closing thoughts on the security news this week?
I was really glad Josh was here. I hadn't met him before, and I'm most impressed. It was a pleasure to meet you.
I hope it's not the last time.
I hope not.
Well, you have to report back to us when you talk to some of your friends about some of the things we discussed.
Yeah, you gave me. I have a long list of homework.
You do.
Even more for me to do unemployed.
Sorry.
Hey, Josh, during the break, Josh, you mentioned, so I had never seen your, so we've never met either. It was really nice meeting you. I'd never seen your site either. So I went out during the break and was reading the website. But one of the things that you mentioned was that you've got a team of volunteers that severely needs your help. Just curious if you just, what kind of help do you need?
Yeah. How does one get involved in the cavalry?
Reach out to me directly or through the alias on the site. But the cavalry is changing, but we take all shapes and sizes. Sometimes it's that you have a flaw that you need help getting addressed. Sometimes it's a policy idea you want to promote or push back on. I mean, we thought we'd attract hackers only, but we ended up with like policy lawyers, junior staffers, all sorts of people, nurses. So if you're concerned about public safety, human life, we'll find a way. We usually have a welcome wagon call and figure out what gets you out of bed in the morning. And usually there's something we could do together.
So most people listening probably don't know you, so go to the website.
Sure. I am thecavalry.org.
Okay.
Nice.
Or Josh Corman on most platforms.
When did you do the first talk on the cavalry?
We were born in Vegas, Hacker Summer Camp, August 1st, 2013.
2013.
If you're interested about what happened in that 10 years, I got the keynote at B-Sides Las Vegas this year.
Yeah.
Very emotional. Like I was actually weeping before I started. I didn't have a prepared slide deck. I had like 3 things I wanted to say, but probably the most important thing that came out wasn't even planned. It's just because I was just.
So by this year, you mean last year?
This
past year.
2023. Yes, the most recent one.
Which is now posted.
It is. So, but if you want to know what kind of things we've done and what kind of things we're headed into, that's probably a good starting point.
Sure.
Awesome.
Well, Josh, thank you. Everyone else, thank you as well. And that concludes this episode of Paul Security Weekly. We'll see you next time. Over and out.